Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming out in the drizzle. That's all I'll say about that. Welcome to our second Conversations. This is the second in the series of a program that we started at the American Academy to begin to highlight the work of the people in the arts and the humanities who have an impact through their work in so many ways. For those of you who don't know us, the American Academy in Rome is the leading international center for independent study in Rome. We have artists and scholars who have the remarkable privilege to spend time in Rome, interacting with the city, interacting with a multidisciplinary community. This is the third year in our series, and I'd like to recognize our season sponsor, the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, for making this possible and also allowing us to take these programs on the road to other cities across the United States. We started a series of thematic clusters, and each year at the Academy, we have these as an armature to build programs, both in Rome and in the United States. And this year, our theme is American Classics. And so we look at ideas of the canon and what it means to be American, drawing inspiration from the Academy's location in Rome. This helps us to think in different ways about American culture, investigating the relationship between uniquely American ideals and the way we think about the nature of 21st century individualism and the images, the architecture, and the art that we associate with empire. Participants over this coming year include leading voices in the arts and humanities, people like the performance artist Ping Chong, or Colm Toibin, the writer on Henry James, speaking in Rome. We have the archaeologist Ian Hodder, composer David Lang. We'll do a conversation with the filmmaker Paolo Sorrentino in Rome. And we have architects Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee in a conversation with composer Andrew Norman, which we'll be doing in Los Angeles. That brings us to our speakers tonight, writer and critic Daniel Mendelsohn, and scholar Kimberly Bowes, our dynamic director in Rome. As we were planning this series last year, this pairing seemed like a natural. Two people who looked at antiquity, looked at the ancient world, and analyzed it in at times, overlapping ways. But throughout their work, there is an interest in lesser-known or often hidden or suppressed histories. So the work that Kim and Daniel do begins to introduce other elements which are neglected or overlooked. We think about Kim's work on late antiquity, looking at religion and poverty. We think about Daniel Mendelsohn's, whose academic specialty is Greek tragedy and Greek and Roman religion, who takes a broad scope to the history of ideas and representation. This notion of recasting what we think about history, or what we think we know about history, is really central to what happens at the Academy. Each year when scholars come, they bring with them their ideas about a specific art form or a scholarly project, which is always informed by the interaction between their ideas and what they find in Rome, in Italy, or in the Mediterranean basin. So it is really the dense layering of history which is part of the critical discussion tonight, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Daniel Mendelsohn is an award-winning author and critic and translator. His essays, reviews, and articles appear in many publications. His books include the international bestseller, The Lost, A Search for Six of 6 Million, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and numerous other honors. A memoir, The Elusive Embrace, a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year, 2 collections of essays, How Beautiful It Is and How Easily It Can Be Broken, and Waiting for the Barbarians. Essays from the classics in pop culture. It's amazing what juxtapositions there are between history and things written on the page. Other honors include the PEN Harry Vercel Prize for Prose Style, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Barnes & Noble Discover Prize. He was an affiliated fellow at the American Academy in Rome and is a member both of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association, and he teaches literature at Bard, and he's just managed to catch a train to be with us tonight here. Kim Bowes is an archaeologist specializing in the archaeology of late antiquity, and she received her BA, summa cum laude, from Williams College, an MA with honors from the Courtauld Institute, and a doctorate from Princeton University. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale from 2002 to 2004, she held assistant professorships at Fordham University and Cornell University. We have upstate in common, and is currently an associate professor in classics at Penn. Kim is the author of 2 books, Houses and Society in the Later Roman Empire, and Private Worship, Public Values, and Religious Change in Late Antiquity. She's been the author of over 30 articles, 2 edited volumes, and also runs a major field project on Roman poverty in Tuscany, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. A 2006 Rome Prize winner, Kim is currently, alas and alack, in her final year as director of the American Academy in Rome, where she also served as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in charge of the School of Classical Studies from 2012 to 2014. It's gone very, very quickly, Kim. And a few notes on the evening. We will ask Kim and Daniel to enter into a conversation, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions. So perhaps a way of starting would be for us to lay out some of the groundwork, no pun, the kinds of things that you both look at in terms of antiquity. Daniel, you thinking and writing about notions of gender and sexuality in the ancient world, and how these are reformed by our current constructions of identity. And Kim, bringing your approach to material culture and the way that material culture reflects identity and social mores in very profound ways. And with that, I will leave you to the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, Daniel, you go first.
Actually, I was so excited when I heard you did your doctorate at Princeton, and I was about to say, oh, when were you there? And then I realized I'm so much older than you. It's actually, I'm sort of excited about this conversation because we're almost perfectly, I would say, complementary in some sense. I'm a literature person, you're a archaeologist, I'm a Greek person, you're a Roman person to a large extent. And I think that's sort of interesting. I got into this business, so to speak, because just when I was in graduate school in the late 80s and early 90s, the sort of the thing that everybody was interested in was the construction of sexuality in the ancient world and how people thought about gender. And, you know, it was coming out of a moment when categories that to us looked natural and self-explanatory were beginning to be analyzed as highly constructed, and the degree to which our own ideas about gender and sexuality differed from the ancients' view of these subjects turns out to be so extreme that they sort of opened up cracks, so to speak, in our understanding of the ancient world that allowed a lot of light to come in. So, for example, what interested me as somebody who was working on Greek tragedy is the dissonance between two facts. One fact is that it's always vaguely embarrassing being a Hellenist talking to a group of Roman people, but in the
we won't hold it against you.
No, I know. I'm here on sufferance. I understand that. In Athenian life and Greek life, ancient Greek life, at the time that tragedies were written, women were, the role that women played in society was highly curtailed socially. Women essentially were not supposed to, this was also to a great extent determined by class, but let's say middle and upper class women were not supposed to leave the house. If they did, they had to be heavily veiled. They weren't allowed to own property. They had no role in government, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, they feature so prominently in Greek tragedy. The great characters of Greek tragedy are the most titanic characters in Western literature almost are all women. And so I got to thinking about the discrepancy between the suppressed role of women in actual Greek life and the highly visible role in tragedy. And that got me thinking about what is the symbolic use of gender in literature, because obviously women didn't act like this, and one certainly hoped that women did not act in real life the way they act in Greek tragedy. Actually, the fact that that's a joke goes to the heart of something, because what I ended up seeing was that the extremity of female passion and action in tragedy was a kind of return of the repressed in some way, that it was, all the people who created these characters were men. And there's a kind of a sense that this is the sort of the nightmare coming back to haunt the male creators, and a lot of very interesting work was being done at the time on gender roles, constructions of gender, sexuality, Greek and Roman sexuality, this is also true of Rome, was very different. At least since the 19th century, our notion of sexuality is based almost exclusively on the object. Right? So if you're a man and you like women, that's your sexuality. If you're a man and you like men, that's your other sexuality, blah, 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 blah. And the more people investigated these categories in the ancient world, it became clear that what was significant for the ancients to a large extent is not who you were doing, but what you were doing to whom you were doing it. So in other words, if you were a penetrator, it did not matter whether you were penetrating a female or a male. That wasn't the key issue, as it is to us today more than ever. So that these ideas of who you were sexually were very different to the ancients in ways that were unsettled our assumption that there's a kind of transparent through line from our culture, which we like in many ways to think stems from ancient culture. We became more aware that they had completely different categories for thinking about these subjects. So I tried to use these insights, which were not my original insights, but this is what was happening at the time, and to apply them to the study of certain Greek tragedies, and to see how women were used in these tragedies as sort of symbolic figures of certain kind of political energies that were coming back to haunt the city. It seems like a very appropriate day to be talking about haunted cities. That's my spiel. I'm leaving. I'm catching the next train back upstate.
That was great. Well, I was actually thinking about how I got into this business as I came here and didn't walk down Central Park West. So why didn't I walk down Central Park West? Because it stinks, right? It smells. It smells appalling because of the horses that are parked there, right? So if you have a choice, right, not Central Park West. South.
She just got off a plane from Rome.
Come on, I lived in Big Moose. It's amazing that I even know what Central Park is. Central Park South. So I didn't walk down Central Park South because it smells. And so how does this relate to how I came to do what I do, which, like Daniel, is to study the other in the ancient world. So people that for a long time have sort of escaped the scholarly radar. I study poor people. And while Daniel's interest in sexuality and women in the ancient world has had now, I don't know what, 20, 30 years of people being interested in it.
I was very young when I started.
It was last year, right? The same can't be said for poor people who remain unsexy, uninteresting, and continue actually to be marginalized in the study of the ancient world. So it's interesting, right, that we both work on things that one would have no problem finding screeds in the New York Times today as a contemporary subject, but which that interest hasn't necessarily been transferred onto the study of the past. One of the things that interests me vis-a-vis Central Park South is the way, so you were talking a little bit about the way in which the past remains a resiliently foreign country, right? The way in which the strangeness of the past, its non-translation into a contemporary world, is what makes it so interesting. The ancient city as the space that lurks through many of your narratives is of interest to me because it doesn't in many ways even remotely resemble its modern inheritor, to which, of course, we are indebted for its grid plan and a whole series of other things that we like to imagine our modern cities, New York City particularly, as being an inheritor of some kind of Greco-Roman model. What wasn't an inheritor of the Greco-Roman model is the complete lack of divisions of space, right? If you were to walk through an ancient city, you would come across the most astonishing juxtapositions of stuff, right? So the equivalent of factories in the downtown, wealthy people's houses juxtaposed next to poor people's houses, the astonishing stench of the ancient city, and the kind of extraordinary democratization of bad sanitation and stinkiness wherever you go. Hence, again, Central Park West. South! And it's really that lack of boundaries that I've found interesting, right? The way in which today, as we probably all found out last night, we actually live in worlds which are bounded even in ways that we don't even think about, right? We live next to people of our own socioeconomic class, of our own political opinion. We surround ourselves with astonishing homogeneity. The ancient city was this kind of collision of every kind of social class, every form of religious practice. There's no insulation in that world, right? Every step that you took outside of the bounds of your own house would have been a collision with things that were different from your world. And so how it is in that physical space that the kinds of boundaries that you're talking about actually get enacted is a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was actually very much interested in that sort of grew out of the set of interests I was describing before had to do with space, actually. I mean, that was a major part of my thesis, that, you know, these spaces that women were at least technically supposed to inhabit were highly circumscribed, right? There's a part of the Greek house called the gynaikeon, right? The women's quarters, which is the furthest, darkest recesses of the house spatially. And I got to thinking about this space because, you know, in many Greek tragedies, women, so as I said, women aren't supposed to leave the house. They're weaving all day long, or, you know, and it's interesting because in tragedy, almost always, when a woman in order to be in the play, so to speak, she has to leave the house because there is no tragedy set inside. There's no interior shot in a Greek tragedy. The stage is an exterior space. It's always in front of the palace gates, say. So if you actually go back and get out your University of Chicago translation of the Greek tragedies and look at almost any play, the first thing that a female character has to say in a Greek tragedy is, I have come out of the house, which is both a bold declaration and also a self-excuse for performing an anomalous action. It's the first thing that Medea says when she finally stops moaning and groaning and the doors open, but you always have to announce, and quite often these announcements are made are followed by an apology. I know I'm only a woman. I know I'm only a girl, but I felt I need to look at Antigone. That's how the Antigone. I've called you outside of the house because we have to talk about this terrible thing happened. So I started noticing these kind of spatial flags and thinking, what's that about? And at least there's the reality of ancient cities, which Kim is talking about, but there's also, and we have the same thing, an ideology of space, which is highly gendered in the ancient imagination. There are, talking about religion, right, there are festivals that are all female. These are the festivals where the women are allowed to come out of the house and celebrate certain kinds of rites as a body, as a community, usually dedicated to female deities, right? So for example, there's a play by Aristophanes making fun of Euripides, which Aristophanes loved to do. And the play is called Thesmophoria Zeusi. Don't say that 10 times fast. And it means, the meaning of the title is the women who are celebrating the Thesmophoria, which is a festival in honor of Demeter. But the premise of the play is that the women of Athens are so tired of Euripides' crazy female heroines, like Phaedra and Medea, that they plot to kill him. And they can only do that when they come together in this all-female space, which men are not allowed to enter, using this female festival as a pretext in order to plot to punish Euripides for his portrayal of women in his character. So there's very much in the Greek theater, both comic and tragic, that is obsessed almost with these spatial divisions, which in a way becomes more interesting if you think about what Kim was saying, which is the reality of these ancient cities is actually very mixed up spatially, and yet there's this notion that there must be this rigid separation between male and female space. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought this is really interesting, and I started tracking these moments when women call attention to the fact that they are literally transgressing, right? That's what transgressing means. You go through, you are making a motion from one space to another space that you're not supposed to be in, right?
So what's really interesting about that is that it's all BS, right? So that the Greek house, as we excavated, you can't find these spaces, right? In fact, the Greek house, as a space, right, it's centered around a central courtyard. It has very few divisions at all. And they've looked so hard for these women's spaces, right? Because they're in the text, they must exist. Wouldn't it be great to find them? We can't find them. And what's clear is that of all the possible candidates, right, every space around that courtyard is completely permeable to everybody, right? The only room that we can actually identify archaeologically is the andron, right, which is the space for men.
The men's quarters. Right,
because the men's quarters gets actual architectural articulation. It gets stuff, right? It gets dining benches because it's a feasting room. Mm-hmm. So that what I think is really interesting about this is the work that the texts are doing, right, to invent space that doesn't actually exist, right? So that first of all, you're back then to your male authors who are not only making women apologize for leaving a space that doesn't exist, which is really interesting, but in doing so, right, bringing that space into being, right? They invent it. So
right, but so it's actually more interesting.
No, I'm saying it's more interesting. That if it actually existed, would be boring.
Well, So, it can be hard to imagine these things, except to use a very banal example, right? No one ever went in the dining room of my house when I was growing up, because that was only for company. God forbid you actually should eat in it, right? And I always think of that when I'm trying to explain the ideology of space in Greek tragedy to my students, because we do have notions about spaces. I mean, we say, oh, those crazy Greeks, but in fact, we have notions about spaces and what are special spaces and what are spaces for families and what are spaces. If archaeologists 2,000 years from now excavate the rubble of our homes from the war that's going to be declared in the next few months, then they will be hard pressed to understand why nobody went in the dining room, right? But if they were able to excavate or reconstruct the phone messages of my mother, then they would understand that there are spaces in the house that you're not supposed to go into. I mean, everyone has this, right? So it's not as crazy as it looks at the beginning. I mean, we sort of do these things, but it is interesting that the archaeological reality doesn't reflect the ideological reality, which means the texts are trying to enforce something that is an idea.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me ask you to talk a little bit about, if you will, another aspect of space that you've talked about, which is also different from our world, or I think you think this is true, which is the fact that Greek drama, which is the most, as you've described it, the most intense form of socio-political critique, right? Of a scale that I think we can't even imagine having that kind of socio-political critique in our own society, takes place in daylight, in public, in which we all are almost obliged to attend, and our responses are gauged by our fellow participants. In fact, we all sit next to our tribe, right? So that we're all sat with our peeps, and such that not only are we watching a spectacle, but in our watching, we're reconstituting our own society, right? We're saying, here's who we are. So talk a little bit about that, if you will, because I think this is an interesting idea.
So there's the space in the drama, which I was just talking about, right? The fictional space that we have to always imagine, because, Greek tragedy, the actual physical accoutrements were fairly, it wasn't like going to see Les Mis, it was fairly straightforward. You don't need a lot to do a Greek tragedy. You need a stage and you need a door, basically, that people can come in and out of, and then you get to see some dead bodies. But yet what's so interesting about it, and this, because we're supposed to be talking about sex and the city, or sexuality and the city, the Athenian, certainly the Athenian sense of the city is so highly developed, right, that everyone in Athens in the Periclean era, certainly and afterwards, is divided into tribes, and each tribe has a hero, and you get, it's like having a football team. Everybody becomes crazy about these characters, and you have a sense of identity. So you're seated in this theater, which you know what these look like. They're giant outdoor arenas. You're seated by tribe. So your civic identity, you don't sit with your relatives from Maryland who came, you're sitting with your tribe. So your civic identity is being highly underscored. And you're watching these plays about kings and queens doing these terrible things to each other in these environments, which I've just described, these highly circumcised spatial conflicts. But the whole thing takes place in broad daylight. You can see the people. It's not, when we go to the theater, it has to be dark, because in order for us to believe in the fiction of what's taking place on the stage, we're not aware. The whole point is not to be aware of your fellow audience members. In fact, you're always shushing them, right? The Greek experience is quite the opposite, right? You're supposed to be aware of your citizens. The people singing in the chorus are your fellow citizens, which establishes a strange kind of relationship between the stage and the audience. And the whole thing's taking place in broad daylight. And of course, the whole thing is preceded by these civic ceremonies. For us, the theater is a secular experience, but no Greek drama in the 5th century BC, when these plays were being written, was, you didn't call Ticketron and order 2 tickets to Antigone. It's not how it worked. There's a giant annual festival in honor of Dionysus, and the entire city attends, the entire citizen body of the city attends. But before you see one word of Sophocles, there are these elaborate ceremonies that are constantly emphasizing the power and the might and the supremacy of Athens, right? The citizens who have done good works for the city are celebrated. The generals that year make a great sacrifice. The orphaned children of men who have died in battle are paraded in front of the audience, who have been raised at the state's expense. And the booty from the wars that have been fought during the previous year is paraded around the stage, right? Then you watch Antigone, a play about a young person who's resisting authority, right? So it's, when we think about tragedy, we have to think both about the spaces that are fictional in the stage, but you always have to imagine the surround, and it changes your idea of what these plays were about and how they might have been interpreted. You know, to have the military might of the city celebrated in this very extravagant way, and then 10 minutes later, Antigone begins, which is about a young woman who's resisting the general, as Creon is constantly referred to in that play, must have been a very strange experience. You know, so I think we always need to remember this civic surround, you know, and you're in a space, you know, where are you? You're in a theater, and behind you is the Acropolis. So it's not just an anonymous, dark experience divorced from reality. If anything, the reality of the city is over-enhanced as a prelude to your watching these dramas.
So when you write about this, Danielle, I get the sense sometimes of a sense of nostalgia for this world. That you, and this is not just you, right? That there's on the part of architects and lots of other people, there's a kind of lament about the vanishing of civic space along with a set of civic values in contemporary cities, and the way in which we have retreated to this private space of the movie theater, the private space of your blog, and that the idea of actually engaging with your fellow citizens, right, in full public gear, and participating in this kind of amazing moment, right, in which we're both buying into and resisting the state, seems kind of fantastic and kind of lost, right? Like that we can't go back to that. Is that true?
Well, I mean, you know, I'd like to think I'm not nostalgic in a stupid way, but I do think that, or a naive way, right? I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I mean, it's not, you know, I don't feel nostalgic for the good old days of 431 BCE, but although, I don't know.
See?
It's looking better and better.
I knew it.
But I do think a lot about the city and its spaces in the modern era. I do think that the sense of communal relatedness that clearly obtained in Athens was a healthy thing in a democracy, because you were always aware of your fellow citizen. You couldn't not be aware of your fellow citizens, whether you were going to the theater, whether you were going to some religious festival. You know, you couldn't get away from them. And I worry a lot about contemporary culture, which seems to be in which the technological means for atomization of the citizen body seem to be proliferating. You know, my favorite example of it, and we all do it, and I don't excuse myself, but you know, all these little gadgets that we walk around with enable us not to have contact with our civic surroundings. You know, if you're walking down Fifth Avenue, and you know, looking at your stock quotes, listening to your music, and talking to your lawyer on the phone, to what extent are you actually walking down Fifth Avenue? I'm not so sure, because you're not seeing the people who are passing by. You're not noticing the things that are right in front of you. And I worry about the kind of corrosion of the civic fabric. You know, in subways, you know, people don't look at each other anymore because they're glued to their TV sets, which they happen to be holding in their hands. And so I mean, in that sense, I'm nostalgic. It's nostalgic for a past I never knew. But I do think there were advantages, because I think that a democracy, in order to thrive, needs to, underscore the humanity and the individuality of its citizens. That is what fosters civic respect. And when you're unaware of your fellow citizens, often, I think it's easier to disrespect them, to not notice them. So that's feeling that I worry about a lot lately infuses a lot of my writing when I'm reviewing, performances and movies and TV shows, and to what extent are these things enhancing our sense of ourselves as citizens as well as just audiences.
This is interesting because I wrote a book about a little bit about this question for the later Roman Empire. So later Roman Empire, right, from like 250 AD till the barbarians come, when everything is going down the toilet, allegedly, which is why it's a very interesting period to study. And the same story has been told about the later Roman Empire, right? That there is a kind of slow erosion of civic cultural values along with civic space, right? So the abandonment of the forum, the forum is a kind of collective space, and all collective spaces, a retreat to the private house, a subdivision of that house even further such that people can retreat inside their own bedroom. And it's an interesting story, and it turns out actually to be completely wrong. But right, interesting in that we wanted to tell that story and associate it with a period that we associate with cultural decline, right? So that good cultural values associated with big open civic spaces and decline and things we're not happy with associated with kind of privatization. Anyway, I want to think a little bit about this image of the city as well, because I think, so my city, for someone who studies material culture, is this messy, stinky place, right? It's a place where average life expectancy is about 30 years old, and in which the sort of respect of people for each other vacillates between this kind of extraordinary care to mass murder, right? The riots of the late Republic, for instance, saw Roman citizens murdering other Roman citizens almost on a daily basis. People who would have lived next to one another, murdering their neighbors, et cetera, and kind of exacerbated and potentially exploding because of the non-separateness that in which people live. And so I have to say that the more I get to know the ancient city as an actual physical space and lived experience, I'm so glad I don't live there.
Well, sure. Look, I'm indulging in a thing that I warned against earlier, which is a kind of fantasy of the ancient world as a reflection of what we want it, often to mean. We all know the laundry list of things that were wrong with ancient Greek and Roman culture. Even Athens at its very best had, as I said, the treatment of women, the treatment of slaves. So, but one can still isolate the parts that seem to work interestingly or well, and be a little bit nostalgic for those, I think. Maybe. If you can't indulge in nostalgia on November 9th, 2016, I don't know when you can.
There are times when nostalgic practices are a bomb. That's B-A-L-M. Thank you. Sorry, in this context. It's interesting to think about your question, Kim, and this conversation could go on, and we want to open this up. But a kind of nostalgia for a moment in which we think about there having been a kind of perfect community in which there was always a kind of reciprocal support for all members of that community, and there was some sort of net, some kind of connection and order and an understanding of where things fit. And it's too easy to say that with the kind of atomization of culture now, the fact that I have an air-conditioned house, an air-conditioned car, and I have the VCR or my TV and multiple screens, I can be very self-sufficient. So there's no need to go outside, nothing at all. So it would be too easy to say that we have lost this sense of community, but in fact, technology allows us to interact in completely scrambled ways in the kind of city that, Kim, you describe, that we now know the most private things about people instantaneously with our access on the web, or even the prime position of making your publicness felt. We saw a demonstration on the way in, or demonstrations years ago at Zuccotti Park. So that public space still means and signifies, right? So how do you then begin to think about your understanding of the kind of mixed quality, and Daniel, your sense of the idealization of spatial order, which is used symbolically in theater? How do you see these playing out in popular culture, in contemporary society? I mean, because this is what you write about Daniel, when you write about movies, and Kim, I know this is what we often talk about when we think about how Rome as a city works, or the kind of relationships across boundaries and the kind of porosity between boundaries.
I actually think that in some ways, what Daniel has argued really beautifully in his scholarly book, which I want to make a big plug for, because it's a great scholarly book on Euripides, two very poorly known plays about Euripides, I think is the possibility of a radical social critique, which is actually only possible when you have these really clearly drawn boundaries, which you can then use as kind of symbolic categories. Women get this fun role of being the symbolic category, right? But you can then use them to do this work and make kind of social critique about authority, about the state, about the importance of the individual versus the state, which quite frankly doesn't exist in our society, right? The degree to which you can actually hold things up to a light and say, so which is more important? Your mom, right? Or your world, right? Would you sacrifice your mom to save the world? These kinds of questions, right, are actually on display in some of these plays. And I wonder if actually the kind of rigidness of many of these social categories actually enables this to happen, right?
Yeah, I think so, because it's a highly stylized, the world of tragic drama is not supposed to be realistic in any way, right? So its conventions become useful symbolically, right? So, for example, in the plays that I was looking at, each play in a very schematic way presents a young or green or untested ruler who makes a bad decision and is affected by the entrance into his decision-making territory by a female character who, by transgressing and entering the male space of political decision-making, actually affects this ruler so that he will then correct his initial error, so to speak, and make a decision that is more community-minded or more moral or whatever. But you can't sort of do that if you don't have these highly stylized and hierarchical and artificial categories operating within the plays. Because then in the play, the woman could say, well, I'm not supposed to be in this space, but here's what I have to say, and now I'm going back inside. And, but if those categories are permeable to begin with, it doesn't have any meaning. Right. So I think it's interesting. I think to come back to something that Mark was saying, and that to try to connect it to what you're interested in, the kind of the scrum of the ancient city space one wonders if it isn't actually being recreated online. This sort of Wild West quality of internet life. Maybe even as we retreat into our highly homogenized socioeconomic living arrangements, right? The way to recapture a sense of the vigorous exchange and bumping into strangers and all of that stuff that we're losing in our actual civic spaces is being recreated online, where you can bump into anybody and say anything, God knows.
Great. Why don't we open this up for questions? I think there'll be a microphone coming around.
Oh, no.
There won't be a microphone coming around, so please
We
project.
get them.
Sorry.
How will we hear you? Yeah.
I feel we didn't talk enough about sex.
Maybe they'll
If
ask us
somebody
about
will
it.
ask a
So,
question about sex, it would be great for our speakers.
Sex questions gratefully received.
Dr. Ruth of the Ancient World.
I have a city question, because I think New York is a dynamic, interactive place, and even though there are all these people wandering around with their noses in their hands, they still do have to interact with those of us who need to go on in our direction. And also Rome and Paris have always had, until very recently anyway, at least until very recently, maybe still, buildings in which the piano nobile was in a building with other floors where other people live who are not nobili, and at the top there are always the maids' rooms, and so on. So there has always been, and when I grew up in New York, we had a great deal of interaction with everybody on the buses, on the subways, on the everything, and on the streets. And I thrive on that. I think this city, at least we walk everywhere, of course, here, and in Rome, and in Paris and London and so on. Not in most of America, but here, certainly, in these cities that are, I think, very dynamic, there's still a huge civic interaction.
You want to say yes?
Yes.
The subway, the subway, I think, is a particularly interesting instance of this. I think, which is one of the reasons that I love the New York subway, right? That the New York subway has that kind of democratizing effect, that you are in literally close physical proximity, if not in the lap, of someone that you may, in the rest of your life, have no sort of relationship with, nor would you have relationship with anyone like them. So I agree with you there. I think that, right, demographically, though, we do have this problem, right? We do have this problem of so for those of us who were shocked by the election results last night, why were we shocked? We're shocked because we actually don't live in a world in which we live next to, talk to, and understand a whole subsection of the population that doesn't agree with us.
Right. Although, to be fair, these conflicts between the city people and the country people, for lack of a better way of saying it, are well documented already in the ancient world, right? I mean, it's an issue in Athenian life too. So that in the ancient world, they also had city mice and country mice, right? And there was perceived to be a difference in values and all of that. So this is also an old story as well.
Noise.
About that sexuality, because there's a lot about the intimo angolo and that, and Topographies, you want to reflect on that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting. I don't know if you've thought as much about the Roman city, because the Latin poets think a lot about the way in which sexuality gets mapped onto the city, and the way in which certain kinds of streets are places where you do certain kinds of things.
I mean, that's a city thing. That's not just a Rome.
Exactly. And the way, although, right, so that if you read Horace and Catullus, particularly if you read Juvenal, right, you get the sense that if you go to the Suburra, right, if you're looking, for a certain kind of action, then off you go to the Suburra and you can find it at various prices. Now, what's interesting, we had a great Rome Prize fellow a few years ago who wrote a dissertation on the Suburra. And what she found, right, is that the Suburra actually turns out to look like every other neighborhood in Rome, and it is unlikely to have had a higher density of prostitutes than any other place. Now, what it had, right, were a whole series of temples and then later churches that were all dedicated to women. And they were women conceived of either as these kind of ferocious warrior types or as virgin goddesses. And so that the Suburra became really good to think with. So it didn't that it had more prostitutes. It's that they were prostitutes in this kind of female landscape in which you paid attention to them more because they were sort of, plying their trade next to the temple of the Virgin Goddess, and wasn't that kind of funny? And then they plied their trade next to the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which was even funnier. Right, so that this is back to the exact same idea, right? That these kinds of things are not necessarily, they don't have a kind of spatial reality, but they're really interesting to think with.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Where did the women hang out in the house? One, and I have this idea of women maybe from urns, of being in these wonderful draping cloth, and assisting the men, maybe, in my imagination. I mean, are the men having banquets and the women are bringing them grapes, or?
Well, the men are having banquets, and the women who bring them in Greek banquets, certainly the women who are bringing grapes in Greek banquets are slave women who are understood to be sexually available. The wives are not at the banquets. They're wherever they may be, the dining room, weaving and doing women's work, right? But so there's also a way of mapping sexuality onto these situations. The banquet in particular is an institution of Greek life, the symposium that's received a tremendous amount of attention because of its sexual mores and what was happening. And but there is a certain amount of segregation. At least, look, we're talking about categories and ideologies to which lip service is being paid. We don't know to what extent these were real, but certainly the literature, you always have to be careful because all your examples are coming from literature, and as we know, literature doesn't necessarily map exactly to life, but certainly the characters in literary works talk about these kind of restrictions and segregations and whatever, which, again, we do the same kinds of things, so, and also to come back to something that Kim is very interesting in, which really is one of the last frontiers, I think, in the studies of the classics, although now finally getting some attention, is class. All this depends on class, because there's no question that lower class women are not sitting around inside, twiddling their thumbs, right? They have to be out in the market selling. There's that great ancient tradition, which is almost undoubtedly false, that Euripides' mother was a vegetable seller. But that's just because people didn't like him. But certainly, so it depends on class. Upper class women can sit around, works of Greek literature are filled with portrayals of royal women and upper class women who were sitting in their quarters weaving tapestries and waiting for their husbands to come home from the battle or whatever. But lower class women clearly didn't have the leisure to do this. So there are many different criteria that affect how we think of who was doing what. It depended in many ways on where you were on a kind of a scale also.
I think one of the other interesting things to think about vis-a-vis this world, right, is there is a moment in which your Greek world and my Roman world kind of collide, right? And vis-a-vis sexual topographies, they have pretty different ones, right? So that women in the Roman world can come to banquets, and they are expected to, and they hang out with their husbands, and occasionally they drink too much. And women in the same empire on the other side correspond to a different set of social mores, so that you actually have, say in the 2nd century AD, you have this immensely complicated multicultural world in which there are dramatically different social mores, right? Much like our world, right, in which certain households in certain ethnicities expect a certain set of behaviors from women in those households, and others, even in a different generation, have a completely different set of expectations. That's a really cool world to think about.
Right, and I think it's also very important to remember that we cannot expect from the ancients a kind of uniformity or coherence of behavior that we ourselves never adhere to, right? So, every time a woman friend of mine gets married, who's a top lawyer and an independent breadwinner and whatever, and then gets walked down the aisle by her father, I think ancient historians of the year 4016 will look back and say, well, those crazy Americans of 2016 with their strange social codes, right? We don't even obey our own social codes because our lives are complicated, and we allow certain kinds of rituals to dominate that we wouldn't, whose premises we would not accept in our normal lives. So I think we should always try to imagine the ancients in a more or less comparable light. We're not consistent or coherent either, and why should they be?
Right.
Thanks, thank you very much. I think there's an anthropologist sitting somewhere in between. Seems like it.
She's very small.
Although I'm an architect, I will dispense with talking about the city. I'd rather go to the sex question, although it's vaguely sexual. I've always been interested in the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, and as often I find when I talk to experts, the story I've read is usually wrong, so I'm not quite sure about her story. But she lived. First of all, she was on the edge, so I didn't know. I mean, she wasn't in Greece, or she was in Alexandria, and then I guess she was in the center. She was in Alexandria. So in any case, she had this rather tragic life where she died horribly, and I always have in my mind this imprint of her holding her menstrual towel in front of all the young boy students that she had, and and it was kind of weird life.
Title IX people certainly went crazy with that one.
So I guess my question is, was she an anomaly, or did she represent some other characteristic of women, that of Hellenistic heritage or something?
Well, have you seen the movie?
I was going to ask, did you review the movie?
No. You have to draw the line somewhere.
For those of you who are...
He's asking a question about Hypatia of Alexandria. I can't remember her date. She's a 4th century Greek philosopher, a female
4th
philosopher.
century AD.
AD, sorry, I beg your pardon. Right, in Alexandria, who's one of the last pagan philosophers at the time of the explosion of Christianity in Alexandria. She is in Alexandria, which actually means she's at the center of the world, and is torn to pieces by a mob of angry Christian fundamentalists. More than that, I will not say. And so her death becomes a kind of a parable about well, first of all, it's a great feminist tale. There aren't that many female philosophers from any period in the ancient world. It's a kind of a parable about the unreason of religion versus this last holdout of the great pagan tradition of philosophy, who happens to be a woman. There was a movie made about her not too many years ago.
Rachel Weisz.
With Rachel Weisz, who was very interested in this. And I will say that I have friends at the Institute of Advanced Studies whom she went to interview when she was preparing for the role, who were deeply impressed by her intelligence and the depth of her research, none of which was reflected in the final product, but, through no fault of her own. But and anyway, there's this famous story about her that as a proto-feminist, she boldly displayed her menstrual cloth to her all-male audience. I can't remember what the reason for this was, but it's not something I recommend to any teachers in the audience in the current climate. But anyway, that's the Hypatia story, and it's one of those. She was actually killed in some horrible
Roof tiles.
Roof tiles.
Yeah, she was torn apart with roof tiles. But speaking of the city, the other sort
Back
of
to the
we have
house.
this, we have listed like in a couple versions, and one of the versions that we have is also about the breakdown of civic society, because she's actually murdered by rampaging monks from the countryside, right? Who've been brought in as kind of hired thugs essentially it was a way of proving the city governor to be both ineffective and not a law and order man.
Right.
So if you're trying to do this, you bring in marauding monks from the countryside with roof tiles.
We'll be screening this film as a documentary next year.
Yes. Reenacted on the streets of New York without the roof tiles. But what was interesting in these versions is they're not interested in female philosopher, menstrual clause, or any of this. What they're interested in is law and order, right? And the fact that a woman could be torn to pieces by a bunch of monks from the countryside, here's your city mouse, country mouse thing again, right, is just, you couldn't have concocted, and it's probably concocted, you couldn't have concocted
Right.
a worse example of the breakdown of law and order.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Ely, you had your hand up.
Question, you mentioned the vases here and the grapes and so on, but I think of, in terms of women's spaces, when I look at Greek vases, is how many vases represent women by a fountain, the bathing,
Yeah.
swimming. There's one in the Villa Julia where they're all jumping into the water, and there's kind of a happy scene of women together, whether it's inside a courtyard or outside, and it happens a lot.
Yes, there's a certain kind of vase called a hydria, which is a vase that you drew where you put the water that you drew from the well. And not surprisingly, a scene that is often just shown on a hydria is women at the well. Yeah. Yeah. John.
Just one question. You said something so fascinating. I never thought of this before about the Greek tragedies taking place at the end of a civic demonstration of civic pride. And you said something which I should say more about is imagine the people who've just been watching the general being celebrated, suddenly being 10 minutes later being challenged by a young girl. What would they have thought? I wish you'd say more about what would they have thought. How do they perceive it? And also, I never thought this. I know about the Roman theater, but was the Greek theater segregated? Did the women sit with the men, or did they sit by themselves?
We still don't know if women went to the theater.
Or went to the theater? So, but I was so fascinated about that, about the perception of women, of this young Shavian heroine, coming out and saying, "I will not do it." How would they have perceived it? Is it possible to say how they would perceive it differently than we can, who just will go to the theater to see it?
Well, it's a little chastening to be telling a great playwright about the theater, but my own sense is that the disjunct between the emphasis on civic greatness and authority that came from these pre-performance ceremonies, it's very hard to imagine, the parades, the war booty, the orphan, everything is about Athens as a great military power. And then so many Greek dramas being about challenges to authority and the disasters that come from sticking up for your principles in the face of authority. But I have to imagine that that was the point, that tragedy, because it's mythic, precisely because it's not realistic, is a kind of safe space. It creates a safe space for the sit-ins to work out.
To get rid of it.
Well, I don't even know if to get rid of it, not to purge it, but to sort of think about the conflicts that characterize our lives as citizens, which are often irresolvable, right? We do have families, we do have private lives, and yet we also get drafted, right? That's basically what the Iphigenia myth is about. The family has to sacrifice something for the state. All families do it in wartime. So that it's not to purge these, but I think to reflect on them more intensely, but because it's a mythic, it's a safe space. And then you leave and your consciousness is enhanced in some way. But I think that's exactly how it was supposed to function. You thought harder about what these sacrifices meant than you might have beforehand.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. It's great to listen to you speak and to think about the impact of symbols and the way we respond to symbols. I think especially now this kind of critical thinking is important. Thank you for being so smart and so entertaining. It's fantastic.
Thanks so much.
It is really the best that America produces, so thank you for reinforcing that. It's marvelous. We will have, if you happen to be in Houston in January, our next conversation will be at the Menil with Amy Silman, and so please join us, and we will be back in New York later in the spring. Thank you so much. Good night.